Hey, last week we started talking about forgiveness. And we've been in this series, we've been talking about, we started with confession, which is us really asking someone else, whether that's God or somebody else in our life, forgiveness for some sin. We're confessing a sin, some wrong that we've done. Last week we shifted to the other side of that equation, which is about forgiveness. And I gave us some good news, because the question was, where do we start with forgiveness? Do you remember where you start? Okay, let's start here. Is forgiveness easy or hard? It's very often very difficult, because you're talking about somebody who has hurt you, who's wronged you, who's injured you in some ways, and it can be a very wide array of how things are done. And by the way, we got some young kids. Isn't that cool? 1.5 to 98 years old in this room. That's pretty cool. What did you say? What did I say? This is an example of needing to ask and confess and ask for forgiveness. And my grandmother offering that. Isn't it awesome the range we have here? But let me ask you this. Do kids need to forgive as well? Yes, kids, don't think that, we're talking about some adult theme here. This is an adult theme, but it applies to every single person in this room. And it's hard to forgive when somebody's hurt us. So last week we talked about where we start. Where do we start? This is always the hard moment when I've spent a whole week and we talked about it and you're like, I don't know, it was a week ago. We start with the fact that you are forgiven. You remember every verse that we read last week says you need to forgive because why? Because you have been forgiven. You are forgiven. Isn't that great news? You are a forgiven human being. God has forgiven you. If you confess with your mouth, He is faithful and just to forgive you. That's what God's word says. You are forgiven. And we start from that place. This is the good news. You're forgiven. And if you don't know that you're forgiven, or you don't think you're forgiven, or you don't feel forgiven, guess what? Our feelings don't really play much here, do they? Are you forgiven? Yes, this is a fact, and this is the good news. The bad news, if there's any bad news here, is that God expects you and me to forgive as well. God has forgiven you, and He expects you to forgive. Now, we admit this is hard to do, because we know that God expects us to forgive who? Everyone. And by the way, I came up with a list of at least 3 people we all need to forgive. And I'm going to use people lightly, and you'll see why here in a second. Who's probably the first person you need to forgive? Yourself. Who's the second person you need to forgive? I heard it. God. You go, wait a minute, I don't need to forgive God. Well, does God need your forgiveness? No, because God has never done any wrong, but you may feel like He has. And you may be angry with God about something. You may be harboring something and you need to let that go. You need to forgive God. And who else do we need to forgive?
Everyone.
One another. See, kids got the answers. They know. We need to forgive everyone, which causes a problem because we don't want to. And on top of forgiving everyone, we need to forgive everything. Don't we? Now, when it's, remember we talked about that scale. Sometimes some of the hurt or sin that's caused in our lives is little. It's not very big. It's the little white lies, the little things that happen, our little quirks in our own. Anyone have a spouse that you sometimes would just like to kill? Mine is because when my wife eats a banana, I have to leave the country. Because I want to cause bodily damage to one of us. I've never heard somebody eat a banana so loudly in my entire life. But would you admit that that's on this end of the scale? But there are real hurts as you move up the scale. Real damage that's been done. I mean, to the point where you get into sexual abuse and even worse, murder. I actually don't know which is worse. But real trauma that's been caused. And as you go up this scale, it gets harder and harder to forgive, doesn't it? But is there anything on this scale that God does not want us to forgive? Everyone and everything. And God means it. Now, last week we talked about, he just took a dive. Last week we talked about some of the causes of sin. And there are two things that sin does. Number one, sin creates distance between us and God, and it creates damage between us and the people in our lives. And I asked you last week, anyone ever caused damage in a relationship that you've had? Damage. Which is why God can say all sin to me is the same. Because whether that distance is a mile or 200 miles, we cannot bridge that gap. But is sin, all sin created equal in our eyes? No. I mean, if I tell you that dress makes you look fat, that's different than if I run over you with my car. Would we admit those two things are different? They're not the same. The distance is, we can't bridge the gap, but the damage can be severe. And the more damage, the more difficult it can be to forgive. So again, we have to start with this understanding and accepting that we have been forgiven, but sometimes that doesn't make it easier because there are other barriers we need to overcome, aren't there? There are some serious barriers we need to overcome when it comes to forgiving. So, and I want to talk about some of those barriers, but instead of just telling you, I want to show you. They say a picture is worth 1,000 words, right? Plus, it's family worship, so we want to have some fun this morning. So I want to show you some optical illusions. You like optical illusions? All right, let's start with this one. How about this one? I don't know why. It should be on the big screen, too. Chip's going to fix that. There we go. All right? What's wrong with this picture? Could you make that thing? Look at that center fork. What is it connecting to? Nothing. All right, how about this one? Is this a person looking at you or a person looking to the left? Some of you are like, my head hurts now. Right? And the answer is yes. All right, how about this one? This one will hurt you. What do you see? It's moving until you focus on one. Focus on one. And this is a static image. It is not a GIF. GIF. That's peanut butter. Is it moving or not? It's not, but it looks like it. One more. Is this a young woman or an old lady? Do you see both? How many of you see the young woman? How many of you see the old woman? How many of you see both? How many of you only see one? All right, see here. If you look here, the old woman, this is her mouth, this is her nose, eye, and this is the feather on the top of her head. Do you see it now? And the young woman, this is her nose and her eyelash, and this is the jawline. She's looking away from you. How many of you are like, I still don't see it? That's okay. Here's the bottom line for all of these. Sometimes things aren't always as they seem, and forgiveness isn't always what it seems. And that's what I want to talk about this morning. Forgiveness isn't always what it seems like it is. And it's important that we understand both what forgiveness is and what it is not. Was that image that was moving, looked like it was moving, was it actually moving? No. So we need to have a right understanding of what forgiveness both is and what it is not. And this morning I want to talk about what forgiveness is not. In fact, I want to run through 13 things that forgiveness is not. Are you ready? We're going to hit all 13 of them. In fact, I got to tell you, I came up with more things that forgiveness is not than things that forgiveness is. And I think some of these things hold us back from forgiving because they either are not allowing us to forgive, or they heap onto this, I don't want to do it because it means I'm going to be doing one of these things on this list. And I just want to tell you, forgiveness is none of these things. Are you ready? Number one, forgiveness is not an option. Forgiveness is not an option. Scripture could not be any clearer on this. Things like forgive others. Does that sound pretty clear? Or how about this? Make allowance for each other's faults and forgive anyone who offends you. Remember, the Lord forgave you, so you must forgive others. I got to tell you, I looked for the loophole. I looked for the place where it says you can forgive anything except this. Or in all these circumstances, but in this circumstance, you don't have to forgive. Every time I looked for it, you know what I found? If you refuse to forgive, God refuses to forgive you. God will not forgive you. Can I just be honest? I'm still having a hard time wrapping my head around that. Because what do I know about God? What do you know about God? He forgives. But there's this connection between Him forgiving us and us forgiving others. There's a relational connection there. Forgiveness, very simply, is not an option. Great news, right? I thought you were going to make it easier. Hang on. So if we accept that forgiveness is not an option, what do we immediately need to know? What do we know immediately? We have to forgive. All right, so let's go on to number 2. Forgiveness is not forgetting. Anyone ever heard this phrase, forgive and forget? This phrase, there we go. Have you ever heard this phrase, forgive and forget? Yep. You know where that is in the Bible? Nowhere. Forgiveness is not forgetting that something happened. And I think we think, well, I forgave that person, but it's still running around in my head. Anyone ever had that? Well, then I must not, and this is the mistake we make. Well, if I'm still thinking about it, then I must not have forgiven it. But we got to get this out of our minds. Forgiving and forgetting is not a human trait. You know where this comes from? God says He forgets our sin. God does. But there's never a place in Scripture where He tells you to forget. He tells you to forgive. To forgive. Now, our memory banks do not work. This is not Men in Black where I just shine the little light and the sin that was portrayed against you is just immediately gone. It's going to be there. It's a fact that we have to wrestle with. So, forgiveness is not an option and it is not forgetting. Number 3, forgiveness is not weakness. Very often I think we get in our heads that if I forgive somebody, then I'm showing weakness and I'm letting them win. Right? Because what do we think about forgiveness? It's just letting it go, right? And if I just let it go, then who won? If somebody hurt me and I don't make sure they get paid back, they won. And it's a sign of weakness. Can I tell you that forgiveness is not a sign of weakness, it's a sign of strength. It's saying in a lot of ways, and without getting into what it is, we're going to talk about that next week, but forgiveness is really saying, I'm letting this go, and I've got the inner strength, not in my own power, but with God's help to let this thing go. It takes incredible strength. The further up this scale you go, it takes more and more strength to actually forgive. Forgiveness is not weakness. Number 4, forgiveness is not painless. And this is a huge mistake we make. We think, well, I forgave that person. Why does it still hurt? Why does it still hurt?
Because sometimes you don't feel like they've apologized.
Because you don't feel like they've apologized. We're going to come back to that here in a second. Why does it still hurt? If you have forgiven, why does it still hurt? Because you haven't completely forgiven? Is that the case? Sin has consequences. That's right. There is pain involved in sin. The further up the scale you go, the more pain. And forgiveness is not saying, listen to this very clearly, that the pain does not exist. But we get it in our head that if I have forgiven, the pain should be gone. Garbage. What forgiveness does is begin to open the door to healing. Let me ask you something. You put a Band-Aid on a wound. Does it immediately stop hurting? No. In fact, how many of you remember those days? I don't know what they do anymore, but anyone remember those days when your mom would pour stuff on an open wound? And sometimes, I'm still not convinced it was good. I remember, and this was bad, I remember when I was little, Mom, you may remind me how old I was driving my big wheel. How many of you remember big wheels? Oh man, I was driving my big wheel in shorts down a steep hill. And I got my leg caught underneath. You know, the wheels get going so fast, and it flipped off, and my leg got caught underneath the big wheel on concrete. Not good. And I ran into the house, and my mother put my leg on a toilet and poured hydrogen peroxide on it. That hurt. And you know what my mom said in that moment? No, she didn't say, suck it up. Yeah, it was one of those that hurts me more. No, she didn't even say that because she knew better. She said, I'm sorry. And if I had said, I forgive you, did that make the pain go away? No, the pain is still there. Pain is caused by sin, and forgiveness does not let go of that pain. What it does is begin to open the door for healing to actually begin. So can you forgive and still feel the pain of what was done? Yes. But if you get those two mixed up, you'll think you've never forgiven because the pain is still there. Now, should the pain be healed at some point? Yes. All right, number 5. Forgiveness is not pretending. And there's all kinds of things we can pretend. Number 1, can you pretend to forgive? Yeah, we talked about that last week. Remember when your mom made you go apologize to your brother or to your sister, and you said, Mom says I have to be sorry? That's pretending. But beyond that kind of pretending, forgiveness is not pretending that the offense never occurred. It's not pretending that it didn't happen. It's not acting like nothing ever happened or that the pain that you're experiencing is not real. But sometimes we think that's exactly what it is. I've got to act like what happened never happened. Is that what forgiveness is? No. All right, number 6. Pretending, and some of these here at the end kind of go in this section go together. Forgiveness is not condoning. It's not saying that what happened was okay. I think we get this one mixed up all the time. Forgiveness is not saying that when you sinned against me, it was okay for you to have sinned against me. You think about the upper end of this scale. Is it ever okay to physically or sexually abuse another human being? Is there ever an instance where we should condone that kind of behavior? But can we forgive that kind of behavior? Yes. See, forgiveness and condoning are not the same thing. Forgiving is not saying that what was done to you was okay and that the pain just doesn't exist. But we've been taught our whole lives that that's what forgiveness is. But can you understand? Okay? And I want to know what this is. Number 7 is not excusing. You're not letting the person. You still continue to bear the weight of the consequence of that sin, even if they forgive you. Yes. I mean, to continue to use this example, if you murder somebody and you're forgiven, does that mean all is well and you don't have to go to prison? No, you still face the consequences of your actions. Forgiveness is not saying that you can. Now here's, I think, where we get mixed up. You can forgive or excuse those consequences, can't you? Could a judge say, you're not going to prison? Yes, I'm excusing you. And there's all kinds of reasons why you might do that. But can you forgive somebody and still they feel the weight of the consequences? Yes. The two are not the same thing. They may go hand in hand, but they are not the same thing. Also, forgiveness is not giving permission for that person to continue to hurt you. Forgiveness is not giving the person permission and saying it's okay for you to continue to wound me over and over and over again. It is okay to set boundaries in your life. Now, are there times when you will open yourself up to be hurt again?
Yes.
Yes. Can we go too far in our boundaries? Yes. And the deeper the wounding, the more likely it is that we'll do that. That we'll shut ourselves off from anyone. Here's the mistake we often make is we set a boundary around the person, not only the person that did wound us, but we set a boundary around everybody. We say, I will never let anybody wound me that way again, don't we? We've got to be careful about going too far on the boundary side as well. It is good to set healthy boundaries with people, especially repeat offenders. Because here's the real challenge we have. If we continue to let somebody wound us, what are we also required to do? Continue to forgive them. Because Peter asked this question, how many times do I have to forgive? Do I have to let somebody hurt me like 7 times? And Jesus says, no, 70 times 7. Just keep the number going. Just keep the counter going. But forgiveness is not saying I continue to allow you to wound me. Well, we get that confused. All right, number 8. Forgiveness, and this is a tough one. I had a hard time writing this one down. Forgiveness is not reconciling with the person. Forgiveness and reconciliation are 2 completely different things. What does reconciliation require? By its very definition, what does it require? It requires at least one thing. And you could come up with probably 10. I see it. 2 people. It takes both parties coming together. Forgive. And they have to confess, and they have to come together and decide that together we're going to let the offense go and we're going to continue to find a path forward together. But does forgiveness require reconciliation? Does forgiveness even require the other person? No. Forgiveness is about you. Does the other person even need to confess in order for you to forgive? No. You can just forgive. Now, if someone does confess, and you forgive, and they forgive, what might be happening? Reconciliation. Should we be reconciled? Yes, but forgiveness and reconciliation are not the same thing. Number 10, and this kind of goes to, I think, what you were talking about, you mentioned earlier. Forgiveness is not conditional. Forgiveness is not, if you do this, then I will. Forgiveness is very simply you letting it go. It does not require a condition. Because if it requires a condition, then what do you have? Well, what don't you have? Yeah, it's not really forgive. Well, it can be. But it's not required. Can you forgive somebody, again, that is not willing to do anything in your life? That is not even willing to admit that they hurt you? Anyone ever been in a situation where somebody wounded you and they refuse to see it? They can't see it? And if you continue to hold on to that, who's the one in prison? You are. You're not hurting them because they don't get it. They don't know. Forgiveness is not conditional. Number 11, forgiveness is not justice. This may be where we get tripped up a lot. Because what do we want? Justice. Use even bigger words. What do we really want? We want vengeance. We want revenge. We want someone to get their... we're red-blooded Americans. Somebody hurts me. Remember the movie, The Untouchables? They put one of yours in the hospital. You put one of theirs in the morgue. And you think, well, no, that's not how we act. Oh, yeah? When the World Trade Centers went down, what did this country want to do? Light it up. Kill them all, right? We'll sort them out later. We want vengeance. You know what God says? Vengeance is mine. Romans 12:9. Vengeance is mine, God says. God says, what I want you to do is forgive and leave the consequences, leave the revenge, leave the vengeance to me, which we do not want to do because we know what God might do. He might let them off the hook, right? Number 12. This is a big one. Forgiveness is not instantaneous. I think we have in our mind that when I forgive, it should be done. I said I forgive, I worked that out. Why do I keep coming back to it over and over again? Because we are broken people who continue. You can be wounded one time and have that same wound hurt you over and over again. Can't you? Wouldn't it be great if we could actually forget the offense? You see, these two things are linked. The fact that forgiveness is not forgetting means you can be re-wounded, at least in your own mind. Anyone ever played a situation over and over and over again in your mind? Anyone ever lost sleep over a single event that happened in your life. Forgiveness is not an instantaneous thing because, and I know this is going to shatter some of your belief system, you're not God. God forgives in an instant. For us, this may be a process. This may take a lot of time. You may have to wake up every day and forgive the offense over and over and over again until God finally heals you of that wound, because the wound is still there. Number 13, forgiveness is not a feeling. Forgiveness is not how you feel about something. Forgiveness is not a feeling, it's what? Any guesses? It's a decision that you make. And we're going to unpack that next week. These last two, we're going to talk in more detail next week. The real question is, what do we do with all of this? Two things I want you to do. I think two, or did I write down three? Three things. Number one is identify, is it likely that you're wrestling with all 13 of these things when it comes to forgiveness? Probably not. There's probably a few on this list that you might be wrestling with and struggling with. So what I want you to do is identify on these 13 things, what are you wrestling with? Do you wrestle with the fact that you feel like, man, I've forgiven, how come I'm not over it? Or have you said, well, I've forgiven, why can't I let it? It still keeps coming back to my mind. I can't forget this thing. Or the idea that I can't forgive because if I forgive, then I'm showing weakness, and I don't show weakness. Men, I'm looking at you. We do this one, don't we? What is it on this list that you're wrestling with? I want you to identify it. Now, you may not even know it, so you need to ask God, what are the things I need? What are the things that I've believed that forgiveness is, and I need to change this thought process? Or I thought that forgiveness meant the pain would go away, and I've got to realize that that's not the truth. So that we can begin, once we understand what it's not, next week we're going to talk about what it is. The next thing I want you to do is confess that wrong thinking and begin to remove it from your process. And here's the big thing I want you to do for next week. Anyone in this room have anything they need to forgive? I want you to write it down. I want you to write that thing down. I want you to actually identify the thing, the person, the action, maybe the date of something that you need to forgive. And come with that next week and begin to think about, what is it that's been holding me back? If my wife told me my shoes are ugly and I need to forgive her for telling me that, what is it that's keeping me from doing that? Is it because I don't want to pretend, or I don't want to let her continue? I don't want to wear shoes around her anymore because I'm giving her permission to hurt me again. But that's an example. If I've asked her how I look in my shoes and I'm hurt by the answer, what should I probably not do again? Yes. Don't ask. Yeah, or don't wear the shoes. But I have a decision to make there, right? If I'm going to keep asking and my wife is going to keep telling me the truth, and by the way, ladies, you do this. You put us in an odd spot very often. Does this make me look, if you don't want the answer, just tell us what you want us to say. That's how stupid we are, okay? That's how dumb we are. Think about the thing that you need to forgive and begin to process, what is it that's holding me back? And then come next week, I want us to find freedom next week. Because next week we're going to talk about what forgiveness is and how you forgive no matter where that forgiveness needs to land on this scale, no matter how hard it is. Are you ready for that? All right, let's stand and pray. Father, I thank you first and foremost that we, every single person, no matter our age, is forgiven. That the blood of Jesus came and paid the penalty for our sin, and that if we confess that sin, you promise to forgive us and to cleanse us from all of that unrighteousness. That issue, I think, is settled in most of our hearts and minds. But there are things in this room. I saw the hands and the nodded heads and the furrowed brows when I asked around this room, do you have something you need to forgive? And for many of us, the answer is yes, and we're still trying to figure out, A, why we haven't forgiven yet, and it may be one or two or three or four of these reasons that we've talked about this morning. And I pray that you'll help us to begin to process that. And it may also be, not only that, but it may also be we're not exactly sure how to begin to go about that process, which we're going to talk about next week. So Father, this week I pray that you'll help us to identify the thing we need to forgive and begin to process that, begin to figure out what it is that's holding us back, because you want us to forgive, and forgiveness is us releasing the act that's been committed against us, releasing that to you. And Father, maybe that's one of the most important things we need to understand, that forgiveness is not something that we do on our own. It's something we do with your help, your guidance, your Spirit's leading. Let us walk through these doors having a heart of forgiveness, having a desire to forgive the wounds that have been inflicted on us, no matter how small or how big. Let us do that for your glory, and all God's people said, amen. God bless you. Have a fantastic afternoon.